Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor in Cape Town, South Africa. Good morning, very good morning, Cobus van Staden.
Good morning.
Cobus, today we're going to talk about the great power politics that are pushing certain African states around. We're starting to see this happen with greater frequency in both, you're seeing it in South Africa and then also in Kenya, which is going to be the focus of our conversation today. But before we get to that, Cobus, I'd like to get your quick reflections on what has been really a fascinating week in the demonstration and the projection of power imagery, what we saw from China last week. It started on Sunday with more than 20 leaders from across the Global South coming to Beijing to participate in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, not anything to do with Africa for the most part. But then the following day, after it was over on Wednesday, then we saw two African leaders show up, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is the president of Zimbabwe, and also Denis Sassou Nguesso, who is the president of the Republic of Congo. Both of them came to town to celebrate with the Chinese the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Both also had bilateral meetings with the Chinese, and there was some news on the Republic of Congo side. Cobus, before we get into our discussion about U.S.-China competition in Kenya, maybe you can share a few reflections on this week that we saw and also the discussions that took place between the Zimbabweans and Chinese and Congolese and Chinese.
On the Zimbabwean and Congolese side, there seems to be a rail deal in the works on the Zimbabwe side. It'll be interesting to see whether they can get it financed and how that'll work. But that is one of the things that they were discussing. On the Congo side, they signed a very big gas and oil deal, like in the billions. I think 23 billion actually. So which will like rapidly increase Republic of Congo's oil output. So it's very interesting. Overall, I think this has been really a big week. I think in addition to the ACO meeting and the big military parade, which is really eye-popping, was also the announcement of the Global Governance Initiative, which is the newest of all of these Chinese initiatives, but which I tend to see as a kind of a holding vessel that contains the other ones, that is, I think, the first time China's really articulated what they think a kind of a multipolar global South-driven full global governance system would look like. Basically based around the UN and other kind of multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization. So it's all very interesting. It was immediately taken as a kind of anti-Western move, it obviously by the West, but it doesn't explicitly exclude anyone. It's generally framed as a more inclusive one, trying to kind of pull more of the global South into global governance. But overall, it's been a very, very kind of like interesting week, notable week, I think.
And if you're keeping score at home, the GGI, which is the Global Governance Initiative that Cobus talked about, now adds to the list of the GDI, Global Development Initiative, GSI, the Global Security Initiative, the GCI, the Global Civilization Initiative, and then the GAI, the Global Artificial Intelligence Initiative, GAII. All of this is under the framework of Xi Jinping's Community for Common Destiny. That is the political architecture for both international and domestic Chinese ideology. This is all part of it. We'll dive deeper into that when we look at some of the Chinese policy issues that are coming out, but this governance one was in fact very interesting. Let's turn our attention now to U.S.-China-Kenya relations. This has been a topic that's been simmering all year. Let me take you back to April when Kenyan President William Ruto went to Beijing, and this has been something pretty common. Ruto's been a very frequent traveler, not just to China, but around the world. In fact, he's drawn some criticism at home for the number of trips that he's done, but he's made regular trips to China. This particular trip back in April was focused on securing financing for the extension of the standard gauge railway and also to secure financing for road building projects. But while he was there, he made an address at Peking University, which is one of China's most prestigious universities. And he said a few things that really rubbed the Americans the wrong way. And let's take a listen to those comments from President William Ruto at Peking University back in April.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kenya and China are not merely trade partners. We are co-architects of a new world order, one that is fair, inclusive, and sustainable. Let us measure our success not in GDP growth or trade volumes, but in how many lives we uplift, how many futures we secure, and how much dignity we restore.
So I think to a lot of people, Cobus, that would sound pretty benign, but the language that he used, the co-architects of a new world order, really got under the skin of a number of people on Capitol Hill in Washington, in part because Kenya is a major non-NATO ally. And that is something that the Americans say, well, wait a minute, how can you be a major non-NATO ally and at the same time then take the side of Washington's single greatest adversary and say you're the architect of a new world order? In the following month after Kenyan President William Ruto made those remarks, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, headed by Senator Jim Risch, a Republican, he, in his opening remarks, took issue with Kenyan President William Ruto and said that it's time now to reevaluate Washington's ties with Nairobi.
Many African nations maintain troubling ties with China, including key national security partners. Just last month, President Ruto declared that Kenya a major non-NATO ally and China are co-architects of a new world order. That's not just alignment to China, it's allegiance. I submit for the record the text of that speech. I'm going to enter it in the record at the conclusion of the hearing that describes this. Relying on leaders who embrace Beijing so openly is an error. It's time to reassess our relationship with Kenya and others who forge tight bonds with China. And it isn't just an embracement of China, but also the, quote, new world order, end quote.
We should be very clear here that when a U.S. senator like Jim Risch says this, that is not the policy of the United States. That is something that is done by the White House. Nonetheless, these comments sparked an uproar and a lot of concern in Nairobi and in the Kenyan media about the state of U.S.-Kenya relations and the closeness between China and Kenya. William Ruto himself came back quite sharp and said, listen, we need to manage our diplomatic relations with China, and we're not going to back down just because the United States is criticizing us. Let's get a perspective now on this from somebody who's been covering this not for months, but for years, our old friend Aggrey Mutambo, who is the Africa editor at the Nation newspaper in Nairobi, one of the top newspapers in East Africa. Very, very good morning to you, Aggrey. Welcome back to the show. It's great to see you again.
Good morning, Eric and Cobus. Thanks for inviting me again.
Well, bring us up to speed now. All of this took place in April and May. It's been a topic you've been covering since then. And this question of Kenya's place in between the U.S. and China is something that is of quite concern to a number of policymakers in Nairobi. What is the situation today as it relates to how Kenya is positioning itself in this new great power competition?
Well, of course, Nairobi has reacted by trying to manage the very anger from Washington. One of the things they did recently is to hire a lobby firm on Capitol Hill to try and speak with legislators there and try maybe to dissuade them from pursuing this aggressive policy of us versus them. And I think it could work, as many other countries have done before, where they use lobbyists to try and push their narratives. But back to this issue is that we've seen Washington itself is not clearly making those kind of threats. It's the politicians there who are doing it, which makes it look like it's probably a Republican issue more than a U.S. policy issue. And yes, and I think from the assessment we've gathered, it seems that the Republicans wanted this kind of if you're a friend, you cannot be the friend of our rival or our enemy, that kind of thing. And to Nairobi, this is very difficult thing to do, considering the number of benefits it receives from both capitals, that is Beijing and Washington. They are not the same. They are not the same kind of arrangements they have. But you cannot just simply compare them. These are like oranges and mangoes, so to speak. So if someone tells you will not eat mangoes because you ate oranges, then it becomes a very difficult choice for you to make, considering that maybe you're just varying your diet, to use that analogy. So in Nairobi, they're really trying to keep both friends without necessarily annoying any side.
And so just to understand, what has Kenya gained from being a non-NATO ally? Like, what does that actually mean in reality?
Beyond the prestige of being on an exclusive list, I think the benefit has been very minimal. In fact, in past U.S. administrations, Kenya got more in terms of security support and maybe intelligence sharing, capacity building, and as well as just the cooperation around the area of counterterrorism. Under this arrangement of Major Non-NATO Ally, I think one of the problems that came about is that the administrations changed in the U.S., one which was very divergent to the other, and probably it stalled somehow without being mentioned. You see, the Joe Biden administration was very keen on building stronger ties with Nairobi, especially since Ruto was looking west. But then Trump, when he came on, he was looking inward. So, probably he didn't care much about NATO, so to speak, and has gone on to say NATO itself was consuming a lot of money from the U.S. without bringing direct benefit to the U.S. And that has brought that attitude to even this labeling of Major Non-NATO Ally. Of course, Washington will not just lift it, but the benefit is very minimal, if you ask me.
Yeah. And when we look at the relationship between the US and Kenya, and then Kenya and China, the relationship with China is quite visible. Obviously, you've got the standard gauge railway, you've got the Nairobi Expressway, lots of infrastructure buildings that have come up in Nairobi as well. Trade, billions of dollars of imported goods, hundreds of millions of dollars of exports. Very big trade imbalance between the two. But when you're on the streets of Nairobi, you feel China's presence everywhere. You see it in the techno phones. You see it in the China House or the China malls that are there. What is the relationship between the U.S. and Kenya today? How would you define it? Is it about trade? Is it about security, politics? I mean, Kenya does not export a lot of oil. It does not export a lot of natural resources, which is the bulk of what the U.S. buys from Africa. So if it's not that, what is the basis of the U.S.-Kenya relationship today?
Well, the basis has been in those intangible things that we spoke about earlier. This is like security support, security cooperation, and also the U.S. has until recently, until of course the U.S. aid was stopped from working, it covered a huge chunk of budgets that served ordinary people. I'm talking about the health ministry. I'm talking about the education ministry. And I'm also talking about those programs that deal with humanitarian affairs, especially in arid and semi-arid regions. So when you go to those deep villages, you will see the U.S. impact. I mean, from the people of the U.S., as the USAID used to say. So those aid impact on the ground could be felt in those remote parts of the country. And then, of course, there are specific entrepreneurs who have benefited from AGOA, that is the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, which in fact is expiring at the end of this month, by the way. So it allowed traders to export certain apparel to the US duty free, and that helped build a very huge entrepreneurial society around here. So there are benefits the US contributed to the economy of Kenya, and not to mention there are American investors also around here.
Well, AGOA died on Liberation Day, so-called Liberation Day, when taxes or import tariffs were put on all Kenyan products. With USAID gone, there's not that. And so I guess I'm going to ask the question that a lot of people may be thinking is that if the United States or senators like Jim Risch are saying you can't be friends with both the Chinese and with the Americans, if Kenya was to choose, and it may act, this is not an academic exercise, Aggrey, as we learned in South Africa and even in Colombia and other countries, this choice may be presented to you. You have to choose China or the United States. Which way do you think a country like Kenya would go?
I do not predict Nairobi making that choice very clearly because there are consequences for making any choice like that.
But it may not be up to Nairobi, though. But it's not, you're saying that is as if it's up to Kenya to make that choice. I'm saying the United States may tell you either you are engaged with us or you're engaged with them, but you cannot have it both ways. And they're going to force Nairobi to make the choice. It's not a voluntary decision.
That would be extreme, but let me give you some history. If we reach that level, I mean, I think the US also knows its politics well around the world. You don't just whip around people just because you want them to behave. Already, Nairobi has already changed its tone, and I think that is enough to please Washington. I don't think we will reach that step where you'll be told left or right. There's no both. Of course, politicians will put it that way, but when it comes to policy implementation, there are also consequences even for Washington. I mean, Nairobi is very strategic. It's one of the stable countries in a very unstable environment, and therefore it offers some kind of certainty in terms of policy cooperation. So, yeah,
I just have to urge you that here in Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam said the same thing, and they got whacked with a 34% tariff before it got downgraded. India was part of the security relationship in Asia. It's intended to confront China, is now on the poop list of Donald Trump. I just don't know if they view any country that is not providing a direct transactional benefit to the White House as important.
Nairobi is willing to do all those transactions for the US, as we have seen. There's already negotiations for some infrastructure projects, and I think the public here thinks it is one way of pleasing Washington. So I think they are also aware of the next step that Washington might take. So it's very difficult, for you to be put in that kind of corner, and I think Nairobi will suffer a lot, and they are aware of it. So,
Cobus, let me put it to you, because South Africa is in that corner already. You're in the penalty box. You much more so than Kenya is. If confronted with this, and I personally believe that is a reality that may actually happen, that the direction that U.S. foreign policy is going isn't that binary, reactionary, extreme way that Aggrey said. What's your take from South Africa on the same question?
Well, South Africa is already scrambling around to diversify its trade and export relationships. It's in a lot of different talks with a lot of foreign companies, including Chinese companies, but not only Chinese companies, to try and get other, to possibly kind of get other entities to take over some of the sectors where that used to trade with the US or export to the US. So I think they're kind of scrambling around. I think if it comes to a situation, I think a lot of it would depend on the specific way that kind of that the specific kind of like mechanisms or triggers that a sensible like kind of pressure would insist on. So, for example, like whether they would insist on cutting diplomatic ties with China, or like withdrawing from like severing Belt and Road agreements or whatever, like and
which they did in Panama, by the way. There's precedent.
Well, I mean, Panama offered, so I think that it was a kind of a preemptive kind of strike from the Panamanian side, but like. I think that would kind of depend a lot. Things would depend a lot on that. But I think overall, the South Africans have such a strong, like, multi-level relationship with China, and they have a strong relationship with the US too. But like that relationship is inherently limited by lobbies. For example, there's, the US has such strong agricultural lobbies. South Africa is a big agricultural exporter. There isn't really that much agricultural stuff beyond what was already going. That trade is not necessarily going to increase very markedly. Whereas, like, with with Asia, there's the possibility of rapidly increasing that trade if you can make it work. So overall, I think the South Africans are just desperately looking around for alternatives, and also non-China alternatives. So they're jetting in and out of Southeast Asia, Turkey, and so on to try and find other alternatives.
Yeah, I should expect to see a lot more South African oranges and South African wine in my supermarket.
Yeah, they're already moving with that. Aggrey, I was wondering, in relation to the infrastructure you mentioned, I saw reports in the Kenyan press that there's been this plan for a US-funded highway between Mombasa and Nairobi, and I've seen it's been going on for a while. It's supposed to kind of echo the train line between, the Chinese-built train line between Mombasa and Nairobi. So I was wondering, I saw reports recently in the Kenyan press that the project is off again, that there's kind of complaints within the US about the possible involvement of a company that has Chinese stakeholdership in there, and I was wondering if what you see the kind of future of these US Kenya infrastructure initiatives will be.
Yes, about that very project, I think there is an issue with the way the Americans wanted to toll the road and raise the money back when the road is finished. So there's that disagreement, which has back to discussions. But that road itself was significant in a way of American rivaling Chinese infrastructure projects, which was the very first time that they had chose to compete with Chinese infrastructure locally here. But you see, the Chinese, the way they fund their projects is very different. Sometimes they come with the concession loans, and then they build, and then they just take back their money afterwards. And I think that is the difference. So going forward, I think Americans may want to, I think it will not be advisable for them to just start competing for those infrastructure projects, because remember, there is also the issue of debt, which is piling here, and the public is very wary of any projects that raise new obligations. And so going forward, I don't think Americans will be going toe to toe with the Chinese. What they will do is probably try to provide alternatives that are more maybe economically viable to the country. We're talking about things to do with public-private partnerships that have lately become popular because they sort of maybe divert or lessen the blow of debt. So I think that is what I project going forward.
But there's a lot of controversy, as there's been with the Chinese-built Nairobi Expressway, that the public-private partnerships require fees that are higher than a lot of normal people, the average person, can afford. And so then what you have is a two-tiered infrastructure system where wealthy people can take the Nairobi Expressway and skip the traffic, and then the average person has to muddle it out. And that's been a point of controversy over that. Also, just very quickly while we're talking about infrastructure, Kenyan President William Ruto has also been talking with the Chinese about restructuring Chinese debt or Kenyan debt. And so the Chinese have about $6 billion of outstanding loans. We don't know the exact amount. Maybe it's around 5. The number's been going down. The Kenyans have been wanting to convert that debt from dollars into yuan in order to reduce some of the fees on that. They have not been able to get a reduction in the debt despite many requests, or to get a freeze, in part because they're repaying the debt. They've been managing the debt very well. And so the Chinese say, why should we take a hit on our debt repayments from Kenya when, in fact, Kenya's been servicing its loans quite effectively? So I'd like to get your take on that, and also the discussions about extending the railway from Naivasha in the Rift Valley all the way out to the Ugandan border in Kisumu. Could you tell us any updates on that? Because there was a lot of talk that this would be a public-private partnership. But again, it required a lot of Chinese financing and Chinese government entities to get involved. And we haven't heard anything since those big announcements. What are you hearing there in Nairobi about the fate of the SGR extension?
Well, the last time they gave us an update, they said that by October, there should be a formal agreement on when the project starts. Because
do you believe that? Do you believe? October is only a few weeks away now. Do you think that's possible?
You did. Yes, it is a few weeks away, but you never know. Maybe a deal could be signed as soon as today. We never know. But I know the biggest concern really is the way the financing is structured. One of the demands the Chinese made was to sort of place the assets of the railway corporation into their hands during the time of operating the project, to sort of give them some kind of assurances and maybe sort of collateral on earning back their money, because they wanted to sort of place other related businesses along the line so that they make it more attractive, sort of things like restaurants or maybe leisure places along the line to attract more people. Because the concern is that if you build a railway passing through the bushes, then it may not attract as many people as if you put it and attach it to attractive sites, for example. So that that is the discussion that has been going on. We have not received any other update for the last 4 months. So some people think it's because the US complaints also came in at this time and sort of slowed down the attention to China as Nairobi tried to, slow down the anger in Washington. So all these things are balancing acts. At the same time, Cobus spoke of alternative sourcing of funds, and the government here has been also speaking to the Japanese to help, get new funding arrangements for other projects so that we just don't look like we are focused on the Chinese. So I think all these dynamics are playing at this time.
Just going back to President Ruto's comments on being co-architects, I was wondering what the reaction was to those comments within Kenya. Like, is that something that makes realistic sense to Kenyans, that Kenya is in that kind of like co-authoring position with China, or was it made fun of?
No, it doesn't make realistic comparisons in Kenya. I think Kenyans are very aware of their position in the global map, but they also know that President Ruto is very good at analyzing his audiences wherever he goes and knows how to give words that please them. You look at his speech when he was in Washington during the state visit, and it was very praised in Washington. And now you look at his speeches in Beijing, and the Chinese were very happy with what he was saying. So this is a person who is politically mature, so to speak. But as to whether he's policy mature, that is a different debate. So I think people are just aware that he knows how to give his speeches to the correct audiences.
Well, the irony is that he says the right things in Beijing, the right things in Washington, but at home, he's struggling given his deep unpopularity that he has. So I think probably, Cobus, a lot of Kenyans are probably just ignoring those kind of lofty remarks. That's my guess, given the frustrations that particularly young people have had with this government for a long time. So, Aggrey, thank you so much for taking the time. It's time for you to go to work. We really appreciate you joining us before your commute. Aggrey Mutambo is the Africa editor at the Nation newspaper in Nairobi and one of the best experts on China-Kenya relations out there. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Aggrey.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Cobus, for inviting me, as always.
Cobus, I think the main point that Aggrey made about the fact that we have to separate Republican talking points and what politicians are saying from actual policy. That said, the gap between those two in this White House is much smaller than it's been in previous administrations. So what was just right-wing rhetoric in the United States quickly turns into policy. And so it's one of the reasons why we do have to explore this. We've also been talking about this in the context of the U.S. recognition of Somaliland, for example, which has really been bubbling up on the right, but very well could turn into policy very quickly. So it's not an academic exercise to talk about this choice that countries may have to make. And again, it's such a sharp contrast to what we've heard over the past several administrations or decades since really the Cold War, when countries were confronted with an us or them type of binary choice. And so, again, we do have to separate. I do want to be very clear that the administration is not saying this. This is coming from Capitol Hill and from politicians, but it is an interesting exercise for us to explore.
Yeah, it's also, I think, we try and elevate global South voices, of course, in this work, and I think this is a really important space to elevate them, because the discussion is so drowned out by both Washington and Beijing, and there's always the risk of global South countries being pushed back into the Cold War, this kind of idea that they're just arenas for action, for external actors, and of course these are complicated countries that are, they're a lot further in their development line than they were in the Cold War, and and the current debate doesn't take into account their own agendas or their own sophistication, so it's really troubling, I think, in that way.
And I just want to tout Aggrey Mutambo a little bit more. He's a very modest guy, and he probably wouldn't say this, but he's been covering this for years. And he's really been engaged in the China-Kenya relationship quite well. So I know people are always looking for different sources of information. I highly recommend you follow Aggrey. I will put a link to his article index at The Nation in the show notes, and also his Twitter handle as well, so you can follow him because he's among the most credible. Let's quickly pivot before we go to what happened in this week in great power politics, where we saw two very contrasting images. And before we went on the air, you said some very interesting reflections about what we saw in China this week and what we saw in the US this week. And I just think it's very interesting, that contrast that was on full display. Maybe let's just kind of tell us what you were thinking about this as you were writing for our subscribers.
Well, it struck me that on the Chinese side, we saw the particularly in the military parade, we saw this kind of super state being displayed, like incredible kind of like techno state basically being displayed in, kind of and at the same time, it's this interesting, very kind of rollback of the roles of the state in the US. So, in the same week there was the announcement that all vaccine mandates have been removed in Florida, for example. So not even school kids have to be vaccinated anymore. So it's very interesting, this kind of rollback of state power on the one side, and this display of the hyper competent state, in China at the same time.
And if you're sitting in Kenya or Pretoria or Bogota or Hanoi, how do you interpret this? As you heard from Aggrey, they're going to try and figure some way out. And in the case of what the Kenyans are doing, they're hiring lobbyists in Washington to try and salvage this. But for these small countries that may not have the full competency of how to keep on top of the very quick changes that are happening in both the U.S. and China, how do they maneuver through this new landscape?
I think largely they're going to try and keep their heads low, diplomatically. I think the issue is that these countries are also facing massive electricity gaps and a huge climate crisis. So, for a lot of these countries, now is the time when they have to move forward with, with solar installation, for example. There's new data came out, that showed solar panel imports and solar panel implementation, and it was striking that a lot of, like, how many of the countries that have the highest levels are actually in the global south, and how far Europe and the US are lagging behind, like a lot of global south countries. Especially in Africa.
One of the data points, and I thought you were going to say this, is the fact that Chinese exports of solar panels to Africa have surged in 2025.
Yes.
So
it's hit the highest level ever.
And it looks like what you were saying is, all along for more than a year now, you've said, listen, if the Chinese taxpayer wants to subsidize solar panels in China and then sell them cheap below market to consumers in Africa, bring it on. And that seems to be what we have here, is just a massive surplus of solar panels that the Chinese are subsidizing, can't sell domestically. And so they're dumping this in places like Africa, which is fantastic news for an energy-starved region.
And for global climate crisis, so China's essentially subsidizing energy transitions around the world, which is a massive global good. The fact that this is all being framed as some kind of nefarious plot, kind of in Western circles, I think reveals a kind of a wider issue with the West's relationship with the world, which I think is like everyone who listens to what is coming, to the kind of language coming out of the West, has that moment where they realize like, oh, you have to listen to what's under the talk, right? Kind of because the talk itself is always, climate justice, inclusion, justice, democracy, right? And then you have to listen to that, and then you have to listen to what's under that. There is this kind of increasingly this kind of thing is that Western discourse is just discourse, right? It's this kind of elaborate, like kind of Baroque discourse. But when you actually need to get something done, something concretely done, then there's a billion reasons why the West won't help you with that, right? Kind of, and in the end, like if you need to get something practically done, like having 200,000 solar panels installed, then you talk to China, because who else are you going to talk to?
Well, I want to draw everybody's attention to a fascinating map that we have on our website. And again, I'll put a link to this in the show notes that details all of China-Africa energy engagement and Chinese solar installations across Africa. It's a fantastic data set, a great visualization. We're going to be launching a paper on this very soon, done by our old friend, Frankton Chiamura, who's a scholar on China-Africa energy issues. So that will be coming out, and we have a whole big initiative coming out on China-Africa energy initiatives later this year. So something to keep an eye on. Okay, Cobus, let's keep it there. There's obviously a lot more for us to talk about, but we do want to start keeping our shows under time, or else people are going to start getting frustrated. We haven't earned Joe Rogan status yet that we can go 4 hours. But of course, if you are interested in these topics, the best way to go is follow us on our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com or on any of our social channels. But if you want to support the work that we're doing and you want to get an amazing digest every day that Cobus writes along with the team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, be sure to sign up at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. If you are a student or a teacher, remember, half off. Send me an email, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll send you the links for those discount codes. Also, very excited to announce that we have hired our Latin American editor, and we're going to be launching in Spanish in October. So we're working on that very project right now. It's very, very exciting for us. So we'll be in French, Spanish, and English starting in October. So for Cobus Van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening and for watching. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast.